Eventually, what we were doing, we chained ourselves to new automobiles in auto showrooms, and they would take our handcuffs off and cart us away to jail and still do nothing.
I just like to get right into it, and something I've been wondering while I was doing my research is that from the very beginning, back in the 80s, you and just PETA in general have relied a lot on that sort of shock factor in your activism. There's a lot of blood, a lot of nudity as well. Do you find it harder nowadays to get that sort of shock factor, that sort of way to get people's attention now that both of that is so readily available to everyone?
Well, we'd rather never use shock or anything else, any gimmicks like nudity, to get people to pay attention to this very serious issue. But the fact is, of course, that just having the facts is boring to people, and that people need a jolt in order to wake up. I mean, we are so violent in what we do in laboratories, in food, in clothing, that sometimes you have to show people what may shock them, but is actually just the fact, the truth, the scene from the slaughterhouse that they are patronizing with their money when they go to buy a meal. And so, yes, it's hard when there's war and there's a lot of sex everywhere. Everybody is more interested in that to keep up.
Right now, or in the very recent years, there has been a group of climate activists come up here in Germany. I don't know if you've heard of them. They call themselves the Last Generation. They've been criticized quite a bit for gluing themselves onto roads during rush hour. They've been throwing paint at major sites and things like that. And in the wake of that, the term eco-terrorism has come up in the wake of that. And I do know that you have been faced with similar issues in the past. What do you make of that?
The next generation people are clearly saying, look, you're going to wipe out your own species. You're going to wipe out everybody on the planet if you don't stop doing the things you're doing. And that's their cause. And they can't get any traction for it. So they escalate. And I have great sympathy for them if they have reached this point, which may not work, because people are selfish, they're greedy, they're insular, and they really could be bothered. They don't want to be inconvenienced. And I'll give you an example from the animal rights movement of how this works, is that when all the car companies in the world were slamming pigs and baboons into a wall to test steering wheels and other crash elements, we wrote very nicely, as we always do, to all the car companies and said, will you meet with us? Will you meet with our scientists? There are other things you can do. They thought, we don't have to pay attention to you. We're huge. And so they didn't. And we wrote again, and they ignored us. And so we started to do things. Eventually, what we were doing, we chained ourselves to new automobiles in auto showrooms, and they would take our handcuffs off and cart us away to jail and still do nothing, still crash baboons and pigs into walls. In the end, our members were giving us their old cars, say a GM, General Motors car, and we were setting fire to it outside the company. And I think at that point, which had taken a while, they thought, oh God, we have to do something, we have to listen. And they stopped all animal experiments. And that's why you see the, mannequins today on the commercials. But most companies think, I'm too big, or you can't touch me. And an individual thinks, well, let other people do it. I'm not going to move myself.
And what do you think about the term terrorism being thrown around in that context? Because that's obviously always a huge buzzword.
Well, I had a friend, he's dead now, who was very big in the environmental movement. And he saw the whole picture, the big picture. And he used to say, yes, we are terrorists. Terra, terra, the earth. So you can call me a terrorist, but I'm going to spell it another way. And I think it's good to make fun of people who do that because it's ludicrous. I mean, to call the very people who are asking for kindness terrorists, and who you are making desperate enough to have to destroy some piece of property to get your attention, terrorists, when really the terrorists are the ones who are ignoring the plight of others.
Well, once even going to those measures doesn't really get people's attention or people's, well, doesn't really get the same amount of people's judgment that will actually get you anywhere. What do you do next? Like once you've taken it up to these sorts of extremes, what's the next step if that does not work?
Yeah, it's a terribly hard question. And I don't think anybody really has the answer except hope. Is that you hope there comes a tipping point where enough people come on board with the idea that society does change its behavior, its habits, its the things it shouldn't be doing, that it's taken for granted, are traditional, the way they've always done them, the thing that they've grown up doing or thinking or whatever. Sometimes that happens. I mean, I look at poor Greta Thunberg, really did everything that she possibly could, and she did it so nicely. She went to all these conferences, and she appeared before various parliaments and the United Nations. And what do people do? By and large, nothing. A lot of people say they care about the environment. Well, if they care about the environment, you won't eat animals because methane is one of the biggest contributors. But no, she really was banging her head against the wall. You just have to hope that people come up with alternatives. That's another very important aspect. With in vitro meat, with taste-alikes, with materials now made of cactus and apple and so on that take the place of leather, which is another environmental disaster, as well as being a disaster for animals. And with the environment, you have people coming up now because they're seeing the climate catastrophe with floods and fires, actually coming up with some alternatives so that your life can carry on being convenient and being nice and not being disturbed too much. That companies are seeing that they have to remain profitable, come up with other ways of doing business. So that's what you always hope.
But then again, by extension, wouldn't that mean that people or even big companies on large won't really take action until they themselves see that it's too late, seeing all these floods, the fires?
I think you've got layers. Companies are particularly bad because, of course, they all live on the bottom line, what's in it for them monetarily. With individuals, though, you've got, and this happens with members of parliament, it happens with members of the Congress, it happens with people in corporate positions of power, is that you have people who never care about anything other than themselves. They don't even care about their own family. They don't care about their own nation, they don't, as most people do. Then you have the fence sitters, the middle of the road, and that's the target audience. And then you have the people who do care, who have an open, big heart, who think about things, who look at the facts and figures, and who are swayed. So you've got 1/3 on you in your camp easily, a big blotch in the middle that you have to persuade, and they could go either way. They could go down to the bottom or up to the top. And so if you get enough of the people in the middle to understand that what you're saying makes sense, then you can, because they're consumers, they buy things, their money matters. They make choices. They can influence companies who are just interested in what sells and what doesn't.
We did get a bit of track there for a second, so I'm going to have to make a bit of a sharper cut again because, after all, we are still a music magazine. So, I I would like to know, out of the campaigns you've done in the past, and you've done a lot of them with a lot of celebrities, who were some of the people out of the music scene that were great to work with, or that just did a lot for you guys?
Well, there are so many. And I mean, for me personally, I adore Iggy Pop and Nick Cave. And I adore Nina Hagen and Lena Lovitch. Lena Lovitch is still on our board of directors of one of our PETA entities. And I talk to her all the time. I will never forget Don't Kill the Animals, which was a soundtrack she did for an album. And we had a concert for that. It was just phenomenal. And I wish it would be revived. It was so good. Pink has been very good to us. The Red Hot Chili Peppers. I'm not very good at this stuff, but a lot of new musicians. Is it Blink 52?
It's Blink 182.
182!
It's fine, it's fine. But I would argue that they're not as new. I think they've been around for a bit over 20 years now.
Yeah, I just saw them come back. Why they're on my mind is I just saw something come up with them and I thought, oh, there you are again. Yeah, I mean, lots of people.
I mean, a lot of those artists do come out of like, let's just call it the earlier days of the punk scene, I would say, especially like people like Iggy Pop. Have there been connections to those sorts of scenes and subcultures where back then, at least, a lot of the activism used to come from?
Yes, absolutely, because there was such a political edge to so much music then. Straight edge, for example. You know, almost everybody in straight edge was animal rights. And then, of course, punk scene is throwing off the veil or the mantle of authority and really examining what you've been taught to believe versus what you actually would believe if you looked at it. And so we have a lot of supporters came out of punk because just having corporations tell you what to buy and eat and wear and so on was not really sitting right with them. Then, of course, we had the protests over war, and the protest songs about war many of the people would understand nonviolence to be a much broader brush than just humans blowing up other humans. So a lot of veganism, vegetarianism became popular among people who are singing against war. And I think that's happening again with Ukraine, is that we're seeing some pop groups in Ukraine, like the ones who won the Eurovision Song Contest, understanding the broader aspects of violence, is that we're not survivalists. You know, we don't have to look at an animal, a different species, but I'm an animal too, and say, oh, you're just a walking coat for me, or you're just a walking burger for me, or you're just a tool for research. They get it. It's one thing. It's a principle. It really is.
I also saw that PETA pretty recently have worked again with Morrissey.
No, but we work with Morrissey on various things because he's a vegetarian, of course.
I mean, yeah, and he's always been a vegetarian, and he's always been very vocal about animal rights as well, but he has also been very vocal about a lot of very different points, which is where I think this point of all of these different kinds of oppressions tying into each other sort of comes back in. How do you see, like, working with someone on this, on one issue who holds wildly different views on wildly different issues?
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, people will say, well, how can you work with this person or that person when they do this or they do that? My answer is always, we're supposed to be trying to bring people along, and we may not always get them to have an all-encompassing view. I would rather that we tried to work with someone on a common issue and hoped they would come along on other issues than we just shut the door because they don't agree with us on everything. And I believe that nobody in this world, almost without exception, is the Buddha. Even the Buddha wasn't the Buddha. They had things that they did that I'm sure we wouldn't agree with, you wouldn't agree with. That nobody is perfect. And a lot of people have areas that drive me crazy that they are so wrong. But if we can work with them on anything, and I think this is how all social movements should be, is don't cancel them, is try to bring them along. You know, there's a rabbi here who has made friends with a KKK chief. And you would think that would be impossible. And yet they decided to speak to each other. And now they are breaking down the barriers of hatred. Doesn't always happen. It can be quite unusual. But I would say try your best to find commonality and not harp on differences and hope the differences will melt away, which they will not always do.
Well, but then again, a rabbi is one person, right, and not an organization of PETA's magnitude. So, I don't know, aren't you worried about the sort of message that it sends out and sends out to the people that do also care about those various issues, working with someone like Morrissey?
No, because if people are going to say, well, we're not going to support you because you support this person who holds a view that is offensive, I would say, well, we almost can't work with anybody because almost everybody holds some view that's offensive. And so we have an obligation to try to find common ground everywhere. And we, as an organization, we're not a corporation entity. We are a collection of human beings. And I think there's so much strife in the world and everybody looking for differences to pick on everybody else. I would say no. Try to work with everybody you possibly can. And if, for example, there was a bill to ban steel traps in the woods, and we joined with hunters, and we're against hunters, because they were against having steel traps in the woods because their dogs get caught in them. So we came together, and together we banned steel traps. Much better than if we hadn't come together and hadn't banned steel traps. Some people say, well, you should only work with people who are against abortion. And some people say we should only work with people who are in favor of abortion, pro-choice or pro-life. And we say, no, we will find any common ground because a turtle who's hit by a car in the middle of the road doesn't care about the position of the person on abortion who stops to help them. And that is our perspective.